Hi class, today we're going to start looking at Cubism, so that is chapter 7 in your book. We're going to start with the two most important Cubists, who are known as gallery Cubists. That's Pablo Picasso and George Braque, and these are the figure numbers in chapter 7 that you should be able to identify by those two. Here are the chapter objectives for chapter 7, things that you should be aware of and be able to explain or understand if asked about them. We will take each of these artists individually and see how they got their start. So each of them came to Paris about 1900. So first we'll look at Georges Braque and his adventures in art from 1900 until 1908. And then we will go back in time and trace Pablo Picasso's journey from 1900 to 1908. And then 1908 is the magical year that the two met, and they created this phenomenon that's known as Cubism. And so for the next 6 years, from 1908 to 1914, they developed this whole new language for art. And so that's how we'll approach them. For right now, the slide you're looking at shows a young Georges Braque. He did arrive in Paris in 1900. He was in the family business. Both his grandfather and his father before him had been house painters / decorators. Designers is probably what we would call them today. And he had already trained with both of them growing up. He was very skilled at having a good visual eye and being able to have a very practical way of applying paint and things. But he had to get his certification, which had to happen in Paris. So he went to Paris to be trained to do an apprenticeship. But while he was doing that, he also began to take classes at night. And it was during those night classes that he started to think about art in a new way, not as something that was simply associated with decoration, but as the art form that it is. Two of his classmates at the time were this woman that you see on the screen, Marie Laurencin, who will become a very significant artist that we will talk about, and Francis Picabia, who also is going to show up later on. So the three of them knew each other at a young age. Braque and Laurencin became really good buddies, no kind of intimate relationship, but they used to love to dance, and they would go out, and Braque was very gregarious and liked to go out and have a good time. Braque got his decorating certification in 1903, but he told his family that he needed to stay in Paris because things were happening in Paris, and he really wanted to pursue painting as a serious art. And so they agreed with him, and he did stay in Paris. And the first art movement that really moved him were the Fauves. Earlier, he had painted in kind of an impressionist style, but between 1905 and a little bit into 1907, he kind of had stopped his Fauve phase by 1906, but 1905, 1907 are the official years that Braque painted in this Fauve way. And so as you can see by these two images, it's kind of rural landscapes or scenes of harbors, and in bright, vibrant colors, sort of typical of the way the Fauves were painting. Like the Fauves before him, he decided that he needed to go out of Paris in order to be inspired, and like them, he went to the south of France. In this case, he found himself going to the south of France to this area known as L'Estaque. And this was the area of France where Cezanne had spent his last years, and in fact had died in 1906 as well. So because he was in the same place, he became interested in Cezanne, and ultimately Cezanne became the person that would help him shift away from Fauvism and explore this other area beginning in 1907, lasting through 1908. He was really focused in on trying to learn the lessons of Cezanne. And on the left, you can see one of Cezanne's paintings here, and then on the right, that's one of Georges Braque's paintings, still in this Fauve way, but you can start to see some of the similar landscape elements of this south of France area where Cezanne had begun the earlier experiments that we talked about in class earlier. This slide is just a reminder of the area where Cezanne lived and worked during his last years. It was in the south of France. It was an area that's very warm, very close to the Mediterranean. It is an area that still has remnants of earlier Roman monuments that were built. So on the left hand in the photograph, you can see some Roman aqueducts that have been revamped into now supporting a train line. And there on the right, you can see an earlier painting by Cezanne of the landscape. You can see Mont Sainte-Victoire in the background and that aqueduct cutting through the landscape there as Cezanne sat there and started working through his ideas about the grid and multiple perspectives and other significant discoveries of his. Two works from 1907 show that Braque is still working in this light palette, sort of fauve light, with the pinks and the light greens and the yellows especially evident on the left. But you can see the aqueduct that's so characteristic of the region, as well as some of these houses. And then over on the right, you can see the way that his color palette is going to change. He's going to start incorporating more browns and more greens in his work and leave some of that earlier bright colors behind. He's going to abandon color for a while to really focus on form. Georges Braque was never really satisfied with fauvism because fauvism didn't really seem to have any deeper meaning. He felt like it was too focused on the beautiful and that it had very little of significance. And he was attracted to Cezanne because Cezanne really seemed to be trying to investigate a new way in the field of painting. Cezanne seemed to be trying to unlock things, to simplify things especially, and to explore kind of the structural underpinnings of painting and also of reality. So this quote here on the slide, "Treat nature by means of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone," is a famous one attributed to Paul Cezanne. It wouldn't be published until a couple years after Braque became interested in Cezanne, but by looking at their work, this is Cezanne on the left and Braque on the right, it's very clear that Braque was really interested in the geometry and the simplification that Cezanne was interested as well. If you look at the brushstroke and how Cezanne creates almost three-dimensional form with the brushstroke, that's something that Braque also tried to copy and tried to investigate as well. Not only in creating these bushes that you can see here on the right, but also in the sky, the way he uses it in the sky to create the same texture as the bush, but we read it differently as the sky. And then also, if you look at the upper right hand, these brush strokes seem to fade into this area of light brown, and it becomes very unclear where things end and where they begin. And so he liked that about Cezanne as well, that there was something that was very solid, but at the same time something that was causing things to come undone. And so if you look at a Braque and you see the way he stacks all these houses, it's like they're falling towards us. He gets a lot closer to his subjects than Cezanne did. And this destabilization that he finds in Cezanne really fascinated him, and his works look like even more destabilization, like they're again falling towards the viewer. Here's another comparison with a Cezanne still life of these apples on the left and Braque's same image, these houses from Lestock that we saw the slide before. And it's the way that he copies the directional focus of these brush strokes. You see them all laid there going in the same direction. That he's trying to build some kind of form on the one hand. So you look at the bushes with those brush strokes and there is form there. You can sort of see the structure of the bushes. And yet the same application in the sky, like I just mentioned before, those brush strokes don't conform to our understanding of sky. And so he is kind of looking at how these brush strokes can mean one thing within one context and another thing in another context. And if you look at the work by Cezanne, you can see Cezanne was doing that same thing. These brush strokes that are all going in the same direction, on the one hand, create the form of the apple, but those very same directional brush strokes also create the surface. And so Braque is just kind of, wondering, what does that mean? The work on the right here is George Braque's most famous work from this early period. It's called Houses at L'Estaque from 1908, and he actually completed it not while he was in the south of France, but once he returned to Paris and was still thinking about it. It was based on some earlier sketches he did while he was in L'Estaque. And again, as we saw earlier, he is giving us a much closer view of some of these buildings in L'Estaque, but now the buildings become just these boxes, these forms that you're not sure if it's the rock or if it's the building themselves. And again, the way he has cut out the horizon line and he's really pushed us as the viewer up close so that these things tower above us. There's no real escape from it. It was when this work was exhibited at the Autumn Salon that a critic first used the term Cubist, because we referred to these as cubes sort of falling towards us, and that's the name that would end up sticking with all of the experiments that he would subsequently do with Picasso and the other artists in Paris who would sort of take up the mantle of Cubism. But in this case, the works are larger, or excuse me, the houses, the cubes are larger, and he's really starting to move away from the direct influence of Cezanne and start to take things in a different direction. Two other works completed in 1908 as well show him still looking at that same subject, still looking at these buildings and the landscape surrounding them, looking at them again from different viewpoints like Cezanne did, and combining all those viewpoints into this chaotic scene, a scene where again there is no escape, there's no background to speak of. You can't look to the sky to save you. Everything is sort of coming up towards your face. And it's this sense that the recognizable landscape is starting to turn into something else. Finally, the furthest that he would go in 1908 was in this landscape, also set in the same L'Estaque area, that gets pretty close to him exploring the gridded forms that Cezanne was doing in his late paintings. So Cezanne was exploring this grid using brush stroke, like you can see in the landscape with Mont Saint-Victoire on the right. And Braque isn't using the brush strokes as much to create the grid, but the lines that you can see, especially in the bottom half of his painting on the left, start to create almost a sense of these squares that come to the surface that create a grid itself. So he's starting to think about this underlying structure that painters have used for centuries and centuries in order to create space and to create order, and he is starting to kind of let that be seen in the way that Cezanne was as well. In these early years, Braque also experimented a few times with still lifes, although he did a lot more work with landscapes. But as you can see in the work on the right by Braque, he is, again, when he is exploring these Cezanne ideas, he's limiting his color to very kind of neutral grays and tans or browns and greens. And he is setting up a still life with musical instruments. That's what he has here. He was really fascinated with music, and that will become especially apparent when he gets together with Picasso and they begin experimenting. But Braque himself was a musician, so was his father. He comes from a family of amateur musicians. He played the accordion, he played the violin, and really any number of musical instruments he could kind of pick up and learn, by himself quite easily. So he was very fascinated by music. So one of his early subjects is this still life with a guitar, and you can see a horn beneath it and a musical composition there. And he's exploring in the same way that Cezanne is doing on the left, but maybe a little bit more radically here. He's exploring different angles, viewing them from their own perspectives, taking the individual items and viewing them in one way, and then viewing them in another. In the case of the guitar, you can see he's viewing I don't know what those things are, the long thing that you hold on to, the arm. Is that an arm? Anyway, he's viewing it from two different perspectives, so that it looks like it's actually been bent, although of course it wouldn't work if it was bent. And then the background, it's not clear where the table is, where the background begins and the table ends, very much in the way that Cezanne has done previously. And these are just two more examples of this early interest in still life. On the left, a still life with bananas, and on the right, again, musical instruments. This is a still life with metronome. You can see the metronome there, as well as its shadow, or viewed from a different way that is attached to the bottom of it in this very intriguing way. And then more musical notation, a composition that you can see standing upright there as well. So, Braque and music, keep that in mind. It's 1908, Braque is in Paris again, and that is the fateful year that he will meet Pablo Picasso. But before talking about that, let's look at what Picasso was doing on his journey to Cubism. The other inventor of Cubism is Pablo Picasso, who would go on to become one of the most famous painters in all of the 20th century. He was Spanish. He was born to a middle-class family. His father was a painter. He mostly did scenes of birds and landscape scenes. But his father also was a professor at a number of art schools. And Pablo Picasso himself was admitted to the National Academy of Fine Arts in Barcelona when he was only 16 because he was such a prodigy. But ultimately he didn't stay. He didn't like the structure of it. And his father was his main instructor. The works that you're looking at here are a couple examples of his work from the early 1890s when he was still a teenager, but really bowling everybody over with his skills and with his ability to paint such naturalistic scenes. One thing you'll notice in this section on Pablo Picasso is that there are many, many more paintings by Pablo Picasso than there were of George Braque, and that is because Picasso was amazingly prolific. He painted all the time, and he just was perpetually painting, and often painted very quickly. By contrast, George Braque was very careful and methodical, and it took him a long time to work on a painting and to consider it finished. So while there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Pablo Picasso paintings and all other types of works like prints and ceramics and things that he did throughout his career, there are relatively few works by Braque, and that is attributed to their different approaches to art. These are a couple more of the academic works that Pablo Picasso did. On the left, you can see a self-portrait that he does when he's about 16, I believe. And then on the right, one of the many studies that he would have done as a student. If you're a student studying in the academy, what you do is you copy things. So in this case, he's copying a marble sculpture that was probably a Greek or Roman sculpture. And you can see that it's a study of light. And he is very adept at being a great draftsman. He captures the reality of the sculpture and the reality of light, and it's a very impressive drawing for a 16 or 17-year-old. In 1900, Picasso moved to Paris. Initially, he went there because his work was included, one of his paintings was included in the Spanish Pavilion, and he was very proud to go. Paris then was considered to be the capital of the art world, and this was his first time exhibiting work in Paris, and he was somewhat expecting that he would take Paris by storm. Perhaps he had a young man's ego, and so he was ultimately disappointed that his work didn't receive any comment in any press releases or anything. And so when he first went there, he originally wasn't entirely sure if he was going to stay there. And in fact, for the first couple years, he would spend months in Paris and then return to Spain and spend several months there. And it wasn't until the end of 1902 that he really put down roots permanently in Paris and stuck around. But nevertheless, he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of artists, of paintings, of the art scene that existed in Paris. And right away, he was very excited to work through some of these modern art styles that he had not had the opportunity to see in person when he was in Spain. Spain was very conservative, and there was no real modern art scene to speak of in Spain. So he was energized by Paris, and as you can see in these works, he experimented with modern styles. These were some of his earliest works he did in 1901, in which he was looking at Impressionist paintings and doing scenes inspired by them. He was going to cafes and visiting concerts and concert halls and going to the same places that these Impressionists and Post-Impressionists like Toulouse-Lautrec had been to. And he was very excited to paint some similar scenes as had been done earlier. Of course, symbolism was on the scene at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and so some of his works have this kind of macabre, creepy feel to them. The work on the left is at a popular nightclub called the Moulin de la Galette, but the people look kind of like they're vampires or they're some kind of creepy monsters that are lying in wait. Over on the right is a self-portrait of him in kind of a quasi-symbolist style, dark and mysterious. The next couple slides just show some of his works in the early years, 1900 to about 1903, where he is really participating in the artistic life of Paris in the years immediately preceding, and also as artists continued to paint even up to that point. So flip through the next few slides and just take a gander at all these great works by Picasso. So the area that Picasso ended up in Paris, where he lived, was this area called Montmartre that I've shown you already this semester. It was an interesting area because it had traditionally been an artist's area, and it still had that kind of feel to it. The slide on the left shows you the bottom of the area of Montmartre. It's on a hill, so at the bottom of the hill there were many businesses, there were shops, there were galleries, there were bars and cafes. But then as you went up the hill, it got increasingly more rural feeling. The streets were dirt streets, and the buildings were falling down and ramshackle. And most of the artists of Picasso's generation and of his economic level, which was pretty poor, lived up at the top of this area. So the scene that you see on the right is more like what Picasso would have experienced in his everyday life. He ended up renting a studio where he worked and also lived in this old warehouse, a former warehouse / factory called the Bateau Lavoir that you can see on the right. And it had a lot of small little rooms that had been rented out mostly to artists or to people that were kind of on the skids. And people lived here in this sort of community. He had a number of friends and people who also lived in the same place. And this is where he sort of spent his formative years in Paris up till about 1908. Picasso did not keep a written journal, but he was always drawing, and so there are sketchbooks and all types of ephemera that he made drawings on during this period, and I've included just a couple of those just to give a sense of him and how he thought about himself. Many times he was drawing his own self-portrait. Both of these are self-portraits, a more naturalistic one on the right, and then one of him as kind of an artist monkey on the left. He and his friends did go out every night. They loved to go to bars. They loved to experiment with drugs. They were drunk half the time. They were stoned half the time. They loved to go to circuses. There were these newfangled places where strange things called movies were shown, these cinemas that showed moving images, and he was fascinated by them. And so these next couple slides are just him being a young guy in a big city. Picasso had many sexual adventures in a big city when he was a young man. This is a image that shows his self-portrait in the foreground, and then a young woman lying on the bed. And then on the other side is Picasso's very best friend, who was a Spanish poet by the name of Carlos Casagemas. And they were very close, and they went out drinking and met women together, and he was a great friend of his. Unfortunately, his friend ended up killing himself. Carlos Casagemas shot himself after this woman that he fell madly in love with rejected his marriage proposal. And so with the death of his friend, Picasso really fell into a funk. It was something that it took a long time for him to emerge from. It kind of was a catalyst for him to relive the trauma of his young sister, who died when she was 7 and he was about 13 or 14, and that was a hard death for him to get over. So he did a series of images of Casagemas dead, or in the image on the left, this image of his burial, and then him mounting on a horse and riding up to heaven. And it's usually the death of his friend that is thought to have begun his first mature period of art, known as the Blue Period, in which from 1901 to 1904 he created these images that were really oftentimes painted in different tones of blue, which is what the period is named after, but also there's this melancholy sense. So it's blue in the other sense of having the blues or feeling sad. A couple of his early images of his friend dead are done in these blue tones. And over the next 3 years, he will paint many images of individuals alone, or maybe an adult with a child, that are kind of pathetic and sad, and they're poor. And it really reflects his mental state, his emotional state. He was very poor, living in Paris, and it's generally this gloomy period in his life. So there are a number of slides to look at, so I will just let you flip through those, and I won't comment on all of them. So one of the remarkable things about Picasso is that he seemed to work in series, and so all of these works that he created during this Blue Period ultimately led to one work in 1904 called Life, or La Vie, which seems to be this cathartic piece. It's a larger painting with more figures in it than typical for the Blue Period. And it's a painting that seems to sum everything up, and after this, he sort of moves on into another direction. Life is a painting that depicts this young couple on the left-hand side, and that is his dead poet friend, Carlos Casagemas, and the young woman who rejected him. And they're in an embrace, and they're looking at this older woman with a child. And then behind them are two paintings, a painting of one person who's alone and solitary on the lower half, and then above it, another painting of a couple they're holding each other, but also seem to be in despair. And they're very different. They're kind of like the paintings of the Blue Period. They're very different than the individuals in front of them. And so in some sense, it's kind of a summation of this trauma that he had been through, this period of profound introspection, and he's now emerging from it. And one of the other interesting things about the painting Life is that it's a painting that he did over top of his earlier painting, the first painting that was ever shown in Paris, this painting that was supposed to make him a star in Paris, but that didn't. And so he uses this as the surface on which he paints this big painting in 1904. So in an interesting way, he kind of punctuates the end of the Blue Period by erasing the painting that started off his time in Paris. It's almost like he's proclaiming, this is a new start, and I'm going to take control of my life in a different way. While he was painting all of these paintings during the Blue Period from 1901 to 1904, nobody was buying them. He made a couple of sales during this time period of work that he was doing, but it was not very, very frequent that he sold works. And so although today paintings from his Blue Period are considered some great treasures, at the time people just thought they were strange and nobody wanted them. Historically, the early years of Picasso's career have been divided into different periods. And so after the Blue Period comes to a close, then what has been considered the Rose Period begins next for the next 2 years as he starts to emerge from this funk that he had been in. So 1904 to 1906 is this Rose Period. It's not like blue completely disappears from his vocabulary, or that he's some of the works from the Rose Period don't seem a little melancholy, but in general there's a lightening of his palette and he starts to explore different things during the Rose Period. Some of the works also show an influence from the symbolists as well. So for example, if you look at this young boy with the flowers in his hair on the left, it kind of reminds you of some of those trippy canvases by Odilon Redon. The colors and the things, it almost looks like he's kind of meditating, or he's sort of tripping and seeing these fantastic light show in front of his eyes. One of the great joys in Picasso's life was going to the circus, and at the time there were a number of circuses that were always traveling in and through Paris. So he loved the acrobats, he loved the clowns especially, and so the Rose Period, he focused a lot on these entertaining things, these things that did bring him joy. A lot of things, of characters that you find in the Rose Period included what are known as saltimbanques in French, or clowns basically is what we would call them. And there's lots of sort of love that happens. There's couples, clown and wife couples. For example, the one you see on the right is the saltimbanque and his wife and his little baby, and then there's an ape in the background. In the work on the left here, you've got Picasso as a saltimbanque. There he is at his favorite bar. It was known as the Lapin Agile, or the Agile Rabbit. And the bar owner is the guy back there playing this like mandolin or ukulele. And Picasso has become the clown, and the woman that is with him is his lover at the time. And so he inserts himself into this saltimbanque life. Finally, in this painting from 1906, The Family of Saltimbanques, it's again a large painting, and it's time for him to move on. He does this large work of a clown and acrobats, and it's as if the circus is leaving, and it kind of marks the end of his Rose period as he goes off and starts to explore something else. One thing of great importance that happened during the Rose period, actually just the beginning of it, was that in 1904 Picasso met these two Americans, Gertrude and Leo Stein, her brother. They were wealthy Americans who had moved to Paris in 1903. They were wealthy, but they weren't like super rich, but they were passionate about art. In fact, Leo Stein was there to study art. He thought of himself as a painter. And one thing they did is they gathered important and interesting people around them. And on Saturday, every Saturday night, they would invite a number of people to come to their apartment, and they would discuss art and music and literature. And they had a number of people come to their apartment from these various disciplines. And it was called the salon, a salon. So the salon at the Steins' house on Saturday night was a very important place to be. Picasso began to go in 1904, and they also began to purchase work by him. Paintings as well as drawings were purchased by Gertrude and Leo Stein, and they were quite enamored of him. He got along much better with Gertrude Stein than he did with Leo Stein, and they formed a special bond and a special relationship. It was at the Steins in 1905 that Pablo Picasso finally met Henri Matisse. They both heard of each other, they knew of the other, but they had not actually formally met. And they got along okay. They were somewhat friendly, but they each recognized that the other was their main rival. And so they had something of a rivalry between them for a number of years that began in 1905 when they first met. At the time, Matisse was quite a bit older, about 15 years, I believe, is how much older he was than Picasso. And in 1905, people were talking about Henri Matisse as the most important modern artist that lived. And for Picasso, who always had this great sense of himself, he really wanted to see Matisse toppled from that height. In the summer of 1906, Picasso had some money because he'd been selling works to the Steins, and so he was able to leave with his lover, leave Paris and go to Gossel, Spain, which is in northern Spain, but it's close to the Mediterranean. It's a very warm area, and he kind of felt this need to go back to Spain and also to just go back to a simpler time. And so what you see there is he kind of maintains the Rose period palette, although it becomes more tan and more brownish than it is red. And he did a number of paintings of young naked men based upon the young nude men that were often the helpers in this region. They were the laborers, and they fetched water and things for people, sort of like the hired hands. And so because this was a Mediterranean climate, nudity was kind of acceptable and wasn't frowned upon as it might normally be. And he did any number of different images of them, as you'll see in the following slides. One of the things that appealed to Picasso about these paintings that he was doing in Gossel was that they were becoming very simplified. And that's one of the things that he had admired about Matisse's work, how Matisse was able to simplify forms and to have compositions that were not too busy or have too much going on. And so that was one of the goals of Picasso as he left Paris and went to this place. And he seems to have achieved it with these paintings of just these single figures who were almost blending in with their background. It wasn't just the young men, but also did paintings of young women, also for the most part naked, There are a few exceptions with more complicated compositions, although he was, again, sort of striving for a simplicity in the way that he was approaching things. Gozel was somewhat of a remote village. People did things there as they had done them for centuries before that, so it was rather isolated. So the image on the left isn't some crazy thing out of his imagination, but a woman who would daily bake bread, and she would walk around the city plaza with the bread on her head and sell that to people who wanted bread. One thing that fascinated Picasso about the region was this type of sculpture that he first saw in a local history museum there, and it's sculpture that's now called Iberian sculpture, and it's sculpture that was created by a very old group of people, a very old culture that dates back to the Neolithic period in Europe, who left behind these stone sculptures, and they're very simple. They're kind of immense, but the facial details you'll see have a great deal of simplicity to them, and Picasso was strongly attracted to them. On the right you can see a map of Spain, and the area in green was considered the heartland of the Iberian culture. When Picasso was in Spain on this particular trip, he was much further to the north and closer to the coast, but he still came in contact with these objects, and he increasingly, as he traveled throughout Spain, sought them out, looked for them in different collections, because he was very fascinated by the fact that they were these examples of primitive, unsophisticated culture, but they were also indigenous to Spain, and he was very much somebody who was very proud of his Spanish heritage, and so that idea appealed to him as well. And what you start to see is that his paintings shift, and his figures start to take on more of the characteristics of this Iberian sculpture. So on the left you can see these works left over from this ancient culture, and they've got deep inset eyes and rather large noses and pretty simplified mouths, and a hairline that is kind of way up on their forehead. And then if you look at the painting on the right by Picasso, you can see that he's given his figures, this figure in particular, these features, these facial features, and he's kind of made her into this monumental, thick build figure. She is painted as if she is stone, the same kind of gray and tan color that many of these Iberian sculptures are. He even completed a self-portrait of himself, obviously, that's what a self-portrait is, a self-portrait in which his face exhibits some of these characteristics of the Iberian sculpture type. Before he had left for the summer, he had accepted a commission from Gertrude Stein to do a portrait of her, and apparently the story goes that he was having a real problem finishing her face, that he had finished most of the painting except for this face, and then apparently after he had come in contact with these Iberian sculptures, he was able to finish her face, and the face that he gave her was similar to the one that he put on his own self-portrait, and similar to these Iberian sculpted faces. Another well-regarded painting that he completes during this time is this work titled Two Women, and in it you have these two women facing each other. It's been suggested that they are backstage and they are about to open a curtain, and that's what has them occupied. But the real significance of them is their blocky figure type, like the Iberian sculptures that tended to be thick and rather monumental, and then the mask-like faces that, again, have those Iberian characteristics to them. And then in late 1906 or early 1907, one of the most significant influences on his developing Cubist style would occur. And that happened when he was back in Paris, and he went to this place known as the Trocadero, and that was an ethnographic museum in which they had a large collection of African objects, masks and carvings. And when he saw these artworks, Picasso was amazed. And he had seen African objects before. He knew that people were collecting them in Paris already. He was friends with André Derain, the Fauve artist, and had seen Derain's sculptures. But he hadn't really thought about them too much until he had this experience in the Trocadero. And that changed everything for him. When Picasso had this experience in the Trocadero with these African objects, it was an experience in which he was disgusted by them, he was frightened by them, and he was attracted to them all at the same time. And it really made him think of the possibilities of artworks to have power. He believed that these artworks had power to protect, as well as power to attack certain spirits and things. Now, his understanding of African art was not very deep. He had a popular misconception of Africa, thinking that all of these sculptures had something to do with magic or voodoo or some kind of concepts like that. So it wasn't accurate from an art historical context. It wasn't accurate about African art at all. But what's important is that his sense of it was profound. And he felt like he had to explore African art, and he had to explore the visual aspects of African objects and try to incorporate it into his own art somehow. He wanted his art to have the same power that he imagined these objects had. So it's a real example of what we were talking about earlier, an example of primitivism, where there's this belief that these non-European art objects have power and have abilities in some ways that European art doesn't, because European art is too civilized and European art is too domesticated. So Picasso began a very energized investigation of the forms of different African objects. He collected a whole bunch of them. They were available now more than they had been even a few years earlier. And so he looked at masks and other types of carvings, and then he would make paintings based upon the object or based upon his feelings of the object. So for the next few slides, I'm going to show you examples of an actual object from Africa, many of which were in Picasso's own personal collection, and then a drawing or a painting that he completed that relates to the visual aspects of that object. Picasso often did self-portraits in the particular style or period in which he was working. So there was a self-portrait back in the Blue period, and then in the Rose period you saw the self-portrait of him as a saltimbanque at the bar. And then also in the Iberian influence period, there was a self-portrait of him with the Iberian features. And here in 1907 you can see two separate self-portraits that depict his face as flat and angular, as if it's been carved out of wood, and you can see the different planes of wood here in the face of Picasso himself. One aspect about certain forms of African carving is that among a group of African people, they preferred their sculptures to have a rough texture on the surface. And so when you look at an object, for example, the one you see on the right, if you notice on the side of the breast and up on the side of the thigh and then down into the lower leg, the surface is really articulated, and that comes from the markings of the carving knife that was used to carve these. And rather than smooth them out, African carvers in some groups preferred this visual aesthetic. And Picasso was interested in that idea. And so in this drawing on the left, you can see him taking the outline of a female form and giving it some of these hatch marks that you see the African artist doing. Although in Picasso's case, they're not the soft, rough forms, but instead they're more precise. They're like the facets of a diamond. So they have this more geometric quality to them. And that is something that he would start to think about and start to explore, the geometry of the different planes as they created form. I like this comparison because it shows the work on the right that he did as a young student, where he is copying a classical marble sculpture, which is typical of the way that Western civilization likes their sculpture, smooth and round and soft, with no blemishes on the surface. And then how he would approach it later, this other drawing of his about 15 years later, when he is intentionally leaving the surface rough and having all of these different facets to them, these different characteristics and aspects. And that's something that him and Braque would end up talking a lot about, particularly as it had to do with Cezanne and Cezanne's brushstroke. So kind of keep that in mind right now. Picasso was also keenly aware that earlier Matisse had shown a lot of interest in African objects, and particularly the way that they simplified form, and that taught him how to simplify things further. Here are two images by Matisse. The work on the right is a portrait of Matisse's daughter that he actually gave to Picasso. So Picasso owned this image of his daughter. The African influence isn't quite as obvious as the work on the left. You don't see the sort of sculptural qualities of it, but you do see the simplicity of her face, which is kind of mask-like here. The painting by Matisse that had all of Paris talking in 1906 was his Blue Nude, which again showed his fascination with African objects through the simplicity of the form and through the exaggerated hips and butt area of this woman. And so Picasso was starting to feel the heat from Matisse. But it was this painting by Matisse, his Joy of Life, that he completed in 1906, but it wasn't shown in Paris until 1907, that really kind of put Picasso over the top, because this received a lot of press. It was considered to be the masterpiece by Matisse at that point. It was widely perceived as just a phenomenal painting. And Picasso thought that he should be getting that attention, that his work pushed the envelope more, and that the rightful title of the greatest modern artist should belong to Picasso. So this really instilled a drive in him in 1907 to make a large statement painting, which is exactly what he did. Picasso began work on a large painting. It was going to be a brothel that was populated by prostitutes. At first, as you can see in the example on the left, one of the sketches for this painting, he was going to include a couple of male figures visiting this house of prostitution, but ultimately he decided to leave them out and just concentrate his attention on these 5 prostitutes in this large painting. And this is the final product. It's called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or the Women of Avignon, although it's more commonly known by its French name. It is considered one of the most important paintings of the 20th century. It's located today in New York City. If you go to the Museum of Modern Art, it's their most valued possession. And it shows these 5 women, and they are shown in an extreme way. When he completed it in 1907, he was too afraid to show it. He invited artists to come to his studio and take a look at it, and everybody was shocked. They thought it was some kind of joke. They were angry about it. Matisse was reportedly very upset about this painting, and so Picasso never showed it until 9 years later. It didn't get shown until 1916. But we will look at this a little bit more in detail in the next class, and then see where Braque comes into the picture in that very next year, and see where they go when they create Cubism.